In this next section of our virtual workshop, we will develop yet another meta framework to help you further organize the major schools of marriage and family therapy so that when a question calls for a particular school of thought, you might remember where that model was developed. While there will most likely not be any specific questions directly asking, for example, where the Ackerman Institute is located, we offer this as a means to further organize all your knowledge about the relationships between the models. Next, we go into greater detail and explain key concepts within general systems theory and cybernetics and communication theory and the major schools of marriage and family therapy. And as a test-taking tip, whenever a question only identifies the therapist as a family therapist, think generically. In other words, go back to general systems theory and cybernetics. In Module 6, we will develop this notion of the generic family therapy model in more detail. So now let's join the workshop.
So, where shall we begin? Okay, so let's you want to begin in Europe. All right, we'll go to Europe. Okay, so we're going to Milan, and obviously the Milan school is in Milan. And who are the major players of Milan? Cecchine, Palazzoli, Cecchine, Palazzoli, and I like to say Palazzoli first, only because she's the foremost person of that group. So Palazzoli, Cecchine, Boscolo, Italy. We make you think. And Prata, P-R-A-T-A, Prata. Now, it's kind of interesting. This won't be on the exam, but Palazzoli and Prata broke off from Boscolo and Cecchine, and Palazzoli and Prata went back to long-term psychodynamic therapy and rejected the whole Milan model. And Boscolo and Cecchine continued working on with the Milan model. Okay, so we have Italy there. Who's in Norway? Oh, you don't have Norway? Oh, you guys. I think I gave you an older map. Do you see Norway? Okay, can you put it on yours? Yes, you can. And who would be in Norway that's an important person that we'd want to think about? Leif Erikson. That's a creative answer. Leif Erikson. Uh-huh. Tom Anderson. Tom Anderson. And where do we place Tom Anderson? What school? Exactly. And so collaborative language. Okay. But he also did have some influence in the narrative school as well. And Tom Anderson's known for what? What's the reflecting team? The reflecting team. Very key player with the reflecting team. Okay. Tom Anderson pretty much came up with it himself. It came out of during and I'll talk about at some point all three different kinds of teams that you need to be aware of and how they fit into the different models. But Tom Anderson ended up sort of using a one-way mirror, and the family was in on the other side, and then they had a brainstorm of why don't we just switch lights on and off in the other rooms, and instead of us watching the family, let's have the family watch us discuss the family. Now that was turned into a formalized team where the reflecting team sits in the room. And there's still a boundary, but there's sort of a meta conversation happening between the two. But that's Tom Anderson. We'll talk more about that later. Okay. What about, let's go down under, and in Australia at the Dulwich Center. Dulwich. D-U-L. Dulwich is Michael White and the narrative model. Correct. And if we go further south to New Zealand, David Epson, also of the narrative model. Okay? And Michael White is really known for a lot of the work around storying and restorying, whereas David Epson took that a little bit further, even though they were partners in the model, with letter writing. Okay? The letter writing component of the narrative model comes from David Epson's work. All right, so let's...
Is it that specific on the test?
I don't think you're going to have any questions about who was in what country. The test is not that.
No, I meant the letter writing from Epson or White.
It could be. It could be. But knowing that both are elements of the narrative model, it's sort of like knowing that, Chloe Madonis in her work with ordeals and love and violence is part of Jay Haley's problem-solving, strategic therapy. So if we come across to, let's say, New York City. What's the major school in New York City? It's the hotbed of feminist family therapy. Ah. Okay, that's a good guess. All right. But where is it? It's actually, I believe, in Manhattan. And it's called the Ackerman Institute. Ackerman Institute is now, which is kind of interesting, we go from the father of family therapy to now the hotbed of feminist family therapy. We like that. That's evolution. Ackerman. Okay, who are the major theorists in the Ackerman group? The Peggies, as I like to call them, Peggy Penn and Peggy Papp. Carter. Marianne Carter. Who else? Betty Carter, sorry. Marianne Walters. Betty Carter. Nope, we said Papp. P-A-P-P. Okay. Betty Carter. Nope. That's in California. And that's when we talk about substance abuse. Okay. Okay, so and who else? Olga Silverstein. Okay. And these are the folks that really are the proponents of the feminist family therapy model, the Women's Project, the Love and Violence Project. Okay. Alrighty. And we go down, since we're in the Northeast, we'll go down to Philadelphia. This is the structural model. The training program's called, or was, it's no longer, Philadelphia Child Guidance. And there's another one, isn't there? Nope. Naj Contextual is in just outside of Philadelphia. And that's the Eastern Psychiatric. What is it? We'll get to it in a second. Eastern Psychiatric something. And so that's Naj. And if we go further south, still on the East Coast, to D.C., who's in D.C.? Haley. No, Mnuchin was actually in Philadelphia at the Child Guidance Center as well. I didn't name that. Mnuchin, Aponte. So Jay Haley is in D.C. at the Family Center. I'm sorry, the Family Institute. Okay, so Jay Haley in D.C. And who was in Georgetown? It's just right on the skirts of Washington, D.C. Murray Bowen. All righty. And we'll go up to... So for DC, you'd want to have, just remember that Bowen and Haley both had their institutes in the DC area. Okay? And let's see. How about if we go to Milwaukee? Solution focused. Okay, with DeShazer and Sue Berg, both of who died, like within months of each other. Horrible. It's been a tough year for family therapy. Lost a lot of key players. And then in Madison, who was in Madison? Whitaker. Yep. And who is in Phoenix? Erickson, even though he's not one of our theorists, but he's key enough that we'll put him on the map. And then Palo Alto. MRI. And who are the players in MRI?
Weakland,
Yeah. Bateson, Weakland, Satir, Haley, Fish. Okay. And who's currently? Václavic.
Is
Václavic.
that the one that looks like Wassler?
That's the one that looks like Watzlawick. Okay. And if we were to put Vancouver, who would be up in Vancouver? There would be, actually, no, Toronto. No, I'm sorry. Yes, Toronto is where EFT, emotionally focused. Okay. And Otto is general systems theory. But in Vancouver would be Carl Tom. Okay. So Ottawa is general systems theory and von Bertalanffy, and Toronto is emotionally focused therapy. Calgary. Oh, okay. Calgary. I said Vancouver. Calgary would be Carl Tom. Okay, in that area, same area. Yes. Okay. So let's just talk a little bit about these schools, and again from this overview of sort of geographically. Von Bertalanffy. He lived between 1972, 1901. He was a biologist. And let's talk about some of the aspects of general systems theory. What do we need to know about general systems theory? There will definitely be questions regarding general systems theory on the test. Okay? Guaranteed. So, what's one of the most important notions? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Okay? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Okay? He also spoke to the idea that living systems are self-organizing. Okay? And that sort of a living system takes information both from its environment but also internally from within. Now, what are the different kinds of ways a system maintains either its balance, which we call homeostasis, or generates negative entropy, which we call, what do we call negative entropy? Growth, or evolution to more complex levels. Okay? Entropy is the force of or tendency of systems to do what? To break down, okay, or deconstruct. Whereas negative entropy is the force of, or the process of trying to grow and become more, to turn into a more complex system. Okay? So we have negative and positive feedback loops, right? And we have also negative and positive input. All right. So non-summativity is what? It's the notion that by looking at all the components of a system, it doesn't really tell us or give us the true essence of a system. That's the sum is greater. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's the notion of non-summativity. Homeostasis is achieved by, again, what kind of feedback loops? Negative feedback loops. Okay. Homeostasis, negative, sameness. Okay. Negative feedback loops. Okay. And again, entropy measures the disorder in a system, and negative entropy is the order or the growth within a system. Oops. Okay. We have another general systems concept that's important called equipotentiality. Anyone want to take a stab at what that means? Equipotentiality. Equipotentiality, okay, is that you start in one place, okay, so an equal starting place develops different potential outcomes. Okay? Hence, in our world, the same intervention may generate different results. Okay? Equipotentiality. Whereas equifinality, different interventions Okay, so we could work with the couple system. We could work with the little kid. We could work with the school system. We could have the whole family come together. All these different approaches to whatever the problem is the family comes to us with might generate what? The same result. Okay? So there are many ways inside a house, is the way I like to think about it. You can go through the front door, you can climb through a window, you can come through the back door. There isn't just one exit point to get to the place where you want to be, which is inside the house. Whereas you, in the previous slide, when you walk through the door of that house, you may wind up in very different realms within that house. It's not going to always take you to the same place. So you walk through the house and the family's having a party. You walk through the house and the family's all asleep. You walk through the house and the family's in the middle of a fight. It's walking through the door, that same intervention isn't going to always give you the same result. Okay? So if we shifted to, again, Gregory Bateson, just to sort of, again, pay attention to sort of, sort of the framework he brings to this field. He was an anthropologist. He really paid attention, like most anthropologists, to being unobtrusive in observation. He wanted to pull back. And he was very interested in sort of the language of schizophrenics. Okay? It's what sort of drew him to the field itself. It's just really paying attention to how schizophrenic individuals communicated. Now, cybernetics is really the study of how information controls systems. Alrighty? And we have, again, as I mentioned before, positive feedback loops, which are offering variety, hence growth. Negative feedback loops, which are bringing a system back to a what? Steady state, okay, or constancy. We talk about first and second order cybernetics, okay? First order cybernetics is that you can sort of observe a system and be independent of it. The second order level of cybernetics, which is sort of almost based on Einsteinian thought, is that you can never observe a system without actually influencing it. I remember once when I was taking my Psych 101 class at University of Miami, we came up with an experiment where we were just going to stand by a stoplight and watch people as they were at the stoplight and time them to see if they crossed the stoplight faster if we were standing there watching them or not. So as we were observing the system, we started influencing the system, even though we were offering we weren't making odd faces or anything. We were just standing there, just watching, and people got through the stoplight faster than they were doing it when they weren't being watched. We talked about, again before, the notion between report and command, and the levels of communication. That's the piece that who brought in again? Don Jackson, in terms of communication theory. And he said it's really important to have congruence between report and command. All right? And what happens when you don't have that congruence? According to Bateson and Don Jackson, it was this notion of the double bind, which he then concluded as being the cause of schizophrenia. Wrong. However, what ended up happening was what? He ended up really sort of labeling what was called then the schizophrenogenic mother. Did a huge disservice to mothers all over the place, and placed a lot of blame on mothers of schizophrenics for being the cause of it. Now, it's not to say that you can't have crazy double bind communication in families with a schizophrenic, but what do we know to be the root cause of schizophrenia? It's genetic. Okay, it's a genetic cause to it. So, again, Don Jackson really brought in notions of homeostasis, looked at symmetrical and complementary relationships. And a symmetrical relationship is what? Yeah, it matches each other. If there's symmetry, people are sort of matching each other, and say they're both working parents, or they're sharing equally in child care. They both do the dishes, whatnot. The point is that there's symmetry. It matches itself. whereas a complementary relationship is one more where there's sort of a dovetailing, if you will, the way things fit together, where maybe one person does the shopping, the other person does the cooking. My wife and I have a complementary relationship when it comes to cooking. Whoever cooks doesn't clean up. Whoever cleans up doesn't cook that night. It fits together. It's not the same. We both don't do it the same. Okay? Just historically, Jay Haley was an English teacher before he even came out to Palo Alto. Virginia Satir was a social worker. Václavic he wrote The Pragmatics of Human Communication. He also wrote a book called what? Change. One of the things that you should be aware of with Václavic is he had a notion of the utopian syndrome. Utopian syndrome. Very sort of interesting notion that I'm sure any of you that have actually had clients come and ask you for the magic prescription, the magic bullet, the magic dust. Sometimes I'm asked for my magic dust because clients, for some reason, realize that we as therapists do have that one insight, that one perspective that is going to, if we give it to them, but of course we never do, but if we were to give it to them, it's going to solve every problem in their lives. Every single thing, if we can just give them that one prescription. That's known as the utopian syndrome. Okay. Okay, so Steve DeShazer, Milton Erickson, and these were all people that were at MRI. Okay, Milton Erickson, we talked about him being in Arizona. He was a psychiatrist, but also a hypnotherapist. Had very brief hypnotherapy. I say therapy up here, but always remember it's hypnotherapy, not therapy per se. And he really used the strengths of the client through indirect suggestion and was very paradoxical. So Milton Erickson is the person that brings in what? He brings in the whole strategic bent to the MRI model and the subsequent Haley strategic in Milan as well as with Mnuchin. Okay. In Philadelphia, Haley studied with Mnuchin, and they were co-directors. Structural family therapy is sort of the hallmark of the Philadelphia Child Guidance Center. And again, this is the model that's very much sort of mirroring the general systems theory emphasis of how systems in general are organized, but in our world, how families are organized. That subsystems are purposeful. Okay, subsystems have direct rules. There's meaning to it. And again, when you go back to general systems, always remember all those general systems concepts. Let's just quickly name some of them. The issue of rules, okay, roles, subsystems, hierarchy, boundaries, right? All systems must have some kind of functionality or purpose or end result they're striving, the system is sort of striving towards. Okay? And Haley really took heart to a lot of what Mnuchin was saying and added hierarchy to his strategic model of therapy. In Philadelphia, or a little bit west of Philadelphia, Naj did his contextual model. And the emphasis there, and it's a transgenerational model, but the emphasis there is that fairness and balance, that you had ledger sheets, that people kept track of things. A good way to think about the contextual model, and we will more in a second, is to think about a good friend of yours that you talk to fairly frequently on the phone. And do you ever make note of whose turn it is to call? Like I call this person, or a sister or a brother. I call this person the last 2 times. It's their turn to call me. That's a ledger sheet. That's the way we keep track of sort of what we are owed and what we owe, and that we have, according to Naj, a variety of ways that we keep track of what we're owed to people, what we owe to people, and what people owe to us in relationships through ledger sheets. Okay. The Bowenian model out of D.C. And Murray Bowen did something very interesting in his work. He was the first person to hospitalize, again, with that research on schizophrenia, he was the first person to hospitalize whole families in little cottages on the NIMH campus. Pretty revolutionary for the late 50s. Okay. Nate Ackerman worked with unemployed people and their families. And again, he's the father of family therapy at the Ackerman Institute. And again, just to reinforce, that is the feminist family therapy, the hotbed of feminist family therapy. In Milwaukee, we have Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg. And this model, again, is really very important in shifting our thinking to second-order cybernetics, okay, which that whole emphasis on sort of shifting to looking for exceptions to problems and sort of constructing reality. It's moving us into that social constructivist stance. Whitaker's symbolic experiential family therapy really changed a bit of the way we looked at family therapy in terms of emphasizing the therapist's use of craziness, his or her own craziness, and came up with things known as battles for structure and initiative. And quickly, who wins which? Who wins the battle for structure? The therapist or therapist does. And who wins the battle for initiative? The family, where they take the control away from the therapist in terms of the direction the therapy is going. Why did Whitaker always use co-therapy teams? Because if he was going to trust his craziness, he needed someone to make sure he didn't get too crazy. If he didn't have a co-therapist, he would bring in his wife. Anyone read Family Crucible? Oh, great book. Gus Napier's book on Carl Whitaker. Well worth reading. Reads like a novel about a family that Whitaker and Napier worked with. There's a wonderful scene in it where Whitaker, just responding to something, tackles the adolescent in the middle of the therapy and wrestles with him on the floor. This is like a 65, 70-year-old man wrestling with the adolescent on the floor. Unfortunately, they don't let us do that anymore. But at the time, it was really on sort of the money in terms of addressing the way this kid was acting in the session, and Whitaker just kind of got fed up with it and entangled him with him. Okay, the Milan systemic, and again, Palazzoli, Chikine, Plata, and Boscolo. And they really looked at the sort of cybernetic or the circularity element that Bateson pulled out in Steps to an Ecology of Mind, emphasized that change is inevitable, and used things like the invariant prescription, circular questioning. What's the other kind of reframe that's not a reframe exactly? Positive connotation, okay, using rituals. And they used a very disengaged family therapy team. So we talked about the reflecting team. The Milan systemic team is a very different kind of team, and we'll talk about that when we go into their model. Down in Australia, we have Michael White, and we are really now looking at sort of how language, sort of, again, following from solution focus, where language is reality. Michael White now is looking at the storying, the sort of constructing, the restoring of the way people present themselves to the world, hence the way they see reality. The notion of externalizing the problem, I like to call it exercising the poltergeist in family systems. Examples of which are sneaky poo, anorexia, depression, noting that those are all capitalized in proper noun status, which is one of the keys to externalizing the problem, or when something's been externalized. David Epson, still part of the narrative model, had people write biographies and used letter writing. He'd write a letter to people after a session to emphasize aspects of when unique outcomes emerged in the context of the session to really underscore it. Would have people write their stories in the form of biographies. Okay? And that's just a filled out version of the map, which we already did.
In the next section, our focus now moves to the greatest level of detail on the primary models of marriage and family therapy. Whenever possible, I will group models under larger conceptual umbrellas, such as the transgenerational models or the strategic models, the experiential models or the constructivist models. We will begin in this next module with the transgenerational models.